You need a hug. A black girl's simple words saved a billionaire who was losing the will to live. I think you need a hug. Can I hug you? The words, soft but crystalline, pierced the frosty hush of Central Park, a sound from a life he'd long since buried. James Holloway, a man entombed in $1,000 overcoat, and a grief that cost him everything, turned his head. Before him stood a little black girl, no older than 5, her cheeks a bright cherry red, against the cold, one mitten conspicuously missing. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, held a steadiness that felt ancient. What? What did you say? He managed, his voice a rusty hinge. You look like you need a hug, she repeated, as if stating a law of physics. His world had compressed into sterile boardrooms and silent penthouses where memories echoed louder than any sound. He was a ghost in his own life, unaccustomed to being seen, especially by a child radiating such warmth. I'm Maya, she announced, shifting on the icy ground. And my mommy says hugs don't fix everything, but they help. A ghost of a laugh escaped him. That's very wise. She puffed out her chest. I'm 5.5. Maya then noticed something on her wrist, a colorful woven bracelet of yarn and cheap plastic beads. With the solemnity of a high priestess, she unfastened it and held it out. You should wear this. It helps when I'm sad. He hesitated, the handmade trinket looking impossibly fragile and precious. I couldn't. But she insisted, her small fingers surprisingly deft, as she slid it onto his wrist, a splash of vibrant life against the cold, dead steel of his watch. It felt like a brand. As he looked up, he saw her mother approaching. She wasn't smiling. Her name was Imani, and her eyes were not tired, but watchful. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen the world's promises break, and was now the sole guardian of the only promise that mattered. She scanned James from his expensive shoes to his haunted expression, her gaze polite, but edged with a warrior's caution. Maya, she said, her voice firm but gentle. What have I told you about wandering off? Maya pointed a tiny, unmittened finger at James. But Mommy, he looked so empty. Imani's eyes met his, and for a moment he felt utterly transparent. Later that night, back in his glass and steel tomb overlooking the city, the silence was absolute. The bracelet was still on his wrist, a defiant speck of color in the monochrome of his existence. He tried to pull it off, but his fingers froze. Removing it felt like extinguishing the first flicker of warmth he'd felt in 3 years. His gaze drifted across the marble floor to a closed white door at the end of the hall. His wife's closet. A mausoleum he hadn't dared to open since the day of the crash. He felt a pull, a strange, agonizing curiosity, to see if anything inside could feel as real as the frayed piece of yarn now circling his skin. The cold brass of the doorknob felt like a branding iron against his skin, but he couldn't turn it. For 3 years, that door had been a monument to his loss, a place of sacred silence. Now the silence felt different, not reverent, but empty. The cheap yarn bracelet on his other wrist seemed to pulse with a faint warmth, a tiny, insistent heartbeat, pulling him not toward the past, but away from it. The next afternoon, defying the logic that had governed his hollow existence, he found himself walking the same path back to the park. He told himself it was madness, but the alternative, the crushing silence of his penthouse, was a slower, colder death. They were there. Imani sat on the bench reading a worn paperback, while Maya chattered to a group of skeptical pigeons. When Maya spotted him, her face lit up with the pure, uncomplicated joy he thought no longer existed in the world. Imani's expression was more complex. The caution was still there, but a flicker of curiosity had joined it. He sat with them, and for the first time, the conversation moved beyond pleasantries. He found himself telling her about his life, not the CEO, life from the magazines, but the real one, the empty one. Today is an anniversary. He heard himself say the words, tasting like ash. The day I lost everything. He saw her tense, her guard fully raised now. He continued, needing to give a name to his ghosts. My wife Sarah, and my son Leo. A car accident. Imani went still. Her breath caught in the frigid air, and all the color drained from her face. She looked at him, her eyes wide with something far beyond sympathy. It was recognition. "Where?" she whispered, her voice tight. "Where did it happen?" Confused. He answered, "Near the BQE overpass, in the Eastwick district." Her eyes shut for a second, a flicker of profound pain crossing her features. "The night of the storm," she said, less a question than a statement. "There was a police chase. The first responders. They were slow." James's blood ran cold. The official report had been so clean, so sterile. An accident. Tragic, but simple. "How would you know that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Imani's gaze was unflinching, filled with a memory she had clearly tried to bury. "I was there," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was a nursing student at St. Luke's. I was in the ER that night. They brought in a mother and her son. The paramedics were talking about how the call was deprioritized. A domestic dispute turned chase in a bad neighborhood. They didn't hurry." She took a shaky breath. "I saw your wife's face. They were going to leave her waiting. I fought for her, Mr. Holloway. I screamed at a senior doctor. I told him he had to look at her now." The world tilted on its axis. The bracelet on his wrist suddenly felt searing hot. This woman, this stranger, hadn't just given his daughter a moment of kindness. She had given his wife a moment of dignity in her last hour. His tragedy wasn't just a random act of God. It was a failure of man, a crack in the system that had swallowed his family whole. And this woman, this quiet, guarded warrior, had been the only one who tried to stand in the breach. The space between them on the park bench crackled with the weight of her confession. James stared at Imani, this woman, who was no longer just a struggling mother, but a secret heroine in the last tragic chapter of his life. The yarn on his wrist was no longer a child's trinket. It was a relic, a testament to a debt he could never repay. His grief for years, a formless, suffocating fog, began to crystallize into something new, a cold, hard diamond of rage directed at a faceless system. And at the center of that rage was a burning, incandescent gratitude for her. From that day on, his visits changed. They were no longer the aimless wanderings of a lost soul. They were a pilgrimage. He learned to see beyond her guarded resilience, noticing the subtle tremor in her hands, when the wind blew too cold, the way she mended a tear in Maya's small coat, with meticulous care, the quiet hunger in her eyes that had nothing to do with food. One evening, drawn by an impulse he didn't understand, he went home and walked directly to the white door of his wife's closet. He turned the knob. The air inside was still holding the faintest ghost of Sarah's perfume. He ignored the designer dresses and silk blouses, his eyes searching for something else. He found it in the back, a simple, dark blue woolen coat, beautifully made, but softened with wear. It was the coat she wore for walks in the autumn, the one she'd pull tight, while laughing, her breath pluming in the air. The next day was bitingly cold. He found them by the lake, and after a moment's hesitation, he held out the coat to Imani. I think Sarah would want you to be warm." He said the words, feeling clumsy and inadequate. Imani looked from the coat to his face, her eyes welling with an understanding that shattered him. She didn't protest. She slowly slipped her arms into the sleeves, and the coat settled around her shoulders as if it were made for her. Seeing her wrapped in its embrace didn't bring the stab of pain he expected. Instead, it felt right. A circle of care, unbroken. A week later, Imani had a mandatory meeting at the shelter that conflicted with Maya's parent-teacher conference. With a level of trust that humbled him, she asked if he could go in her place. He agreed without a second thought. The teacher described Maya as a remarkable child, bright and curious. But she also mentioned something else. "She draws the most wonderful pictures," the teacher said, pulling one out. "But lately, she always draws a big gray storm cloud over her houses." That single detail, a child's simple rendering of insecurity, struck James with the force of a physical blow. They were not safe. Kindness and warm coats were not enough. He was a billionaire, a man who could move markets with a single phone call, yet he was letting this brilliant child and her warrior mother sleep under a storm cloud, night after night, in a place where the system itself was the biggest monster. He walked out of that school, not as a grieving man, but as a man with a mission. He looked down at the bracelet, then thought of Imani in his wife's coat, and of Maya's drawing. It wasn't enough to be their friend. It wasn't enough to feel grateful. He had to get them out. The image of Maya's drawing that lonely house under a storm cloud was burned into his mind. It was a verdict on his inaction. The next day, he didn't go to the park. He went to his real estate office and pulled the file for a property he hadn't thought about in years. A modest one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side, clean safe, and currently empty. That evening, he met Imani on their usual bench, but his purpose was different. He felt a tremor of fear, not for himself, but of wounding her pride, which he knew was the last armor she had left. "Imani," he began, his voice low, "I know you didn't ask for this, and I know you don't need a savior. But I need to ask you something." He told her about the apartment. He watched her face shudder, the familiar guard slamming down. "James, I can't," she said immediately, her voice sharp with dignity. "We're not a charity case." He held up a hand. "This isn't charity. It's balance. It's a debt. To the student nurse who screamed at a doctor for a stranger's wife. To the mother of the little girl who gave a ghost his heartbeat back. It's an empty space, Imani. Let me fill it with something good. Let me do this for my own soul, not just for yours. Give Maya a door she can lock at night. Erase that storm cloud." He saw the war in her eyes, her fierce independence, battling the desperate primal need to protect her child. It was the mention of Maya's drawing that finally broke through. Her shoulders slumped in a gesture of exhausted surrender that was more courageous than any defiance. The day they moved in was quiet. There was no moving truck, just a few bags and a box of books. When James opened the door, Maya gasped. She ran inside, her small boots thudding on the hardwood floors, and claimed a sunny corner by the window as her own. Imani stepped in slowly, her hand tracing the clean wall, as if she couldn't believe it was real. She walked into the small bedroom, saw the simple bed with a new quilt he'd bought, and finally let out a single, soundless sob. For the first time in years, they were home. They had 1 week of peace. It was a fragile, beautiful thing. Then the system found them. Imani, following protocol, had notified the shelter of her new address. One afternoon, a stern, tired-looking woman named Ms. Davis from the shelter administration appeared at their door. "Imani Jones," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. "I'm here about your case file." She explained in the cold, detached language of bureaucracy that Imani had violated protocol. "You accepted housing from an unvetted private source without clearance. You abandoned the process. This is considered an unstable environment." Imani was stunned. "Unstable? This is the safest we've been in years." Ms. Davis's eyes were flat, her expression a mask of regulations. "That is not for you to determine. By breaking the rules, you have put your daughter's placement in our system at risk. Frankly, this could be seen as endangerment. We have a duty to notify Child Protective Services." The words hung in the air, venomous and cold. Endangerment. The one thing she had fought every second of every day to prevent. Her act of salvation was being twisted into a weapon against her. The safe harbor was a trap. As soon as the woman left, Imani's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She fumbled for her phone and dialed James, her voice a choked, terrified whisper. "James, they're going to take her. They're going to take Maya." His name was a choked whisper on the phone, but James heard the primal terror beneath it. The grief that had haunted him for years was instantly vaporized by a white-hot protective rage. The quiet man on the park bench vanished, and in his place rose the CEO, the predator, who had built an empire on calculated calm and decisive action. "Stay there. Lock the door. Don't speak to anyone. I'm handling it," he said, his voice a blade of ice. He didn't just call his usual team of corporate litigators. This wasn't a contract dispute. It was a street fight against a different kind of monster. He made one call to a name he'd been given years ago for the Holloway Foundation's pro bono work. He needed a warrior. An hour later, he was sitting across from Robin Clean, a woman with eyes that seemed to strip away pretense, and a reputation for dismantling corrupt bureaucracies for breakfast. She wasn't impressed by his suit or his name. She listened, her face an unreadable mask, as he laid out the situation. He could see the skepticism in her posture. She'd seen powerful men develop projects before. "So, you gave a homeless woman an apartment, and now her former shelter is retaliating. It's a classic intimidation tactic," she said, her tone clinical. "They're banking on her being too poor and too scared to fight." James leaned forward. "This is different." And then he told her everything. Not just about the apartment, but about the bracelet, about the park bench, and finally, about the night in the ER. He told her how Imani, a terrified nursing student, had fought for his dying wife when the system had turned its back. As he spoke, he watched Robin's expression shift. The cynical lawyer receded, and the warrior emerged. "I see," she said, her voice softer now. "This isn't charity. It's a debt." She agreed to take the case, but on one condition. "I need to hear it from her. All of it." The meeting in the new apartment was thick with tension. Imani was pale, feeling the weight of the trouble she believed she'd brought to his door. But as Robin gently prompted her, she began to speak. She spoke of the shelter's stale food, of the shouting that echoed in the halls at night, of the soul-crushing humiliation of having to beg for basic dignity. As she talked, a transformation occurred. Her fear began to burn away, replaced by the steady, defiant flame of a woman who had been pushed too far. She was no longer a victim, recounting her trauma. She was a witness, building her case, her voice growing stronger with every painful memory. James sat beside her, silent, his presence a steady anchor. He didn't speak for her. He didn't have to. He was simply there, a testament to the truth of her words. That evening, Robin filed for an emergency injunction against the shelter and any affiliated agency. They had a court date. The first battle was set. The apartment, once a symbol of peace, now felt like a war room. That night, after Maya was asleep, Imani turned to him, the legal documents sitting like a grenade on the coffee table between them. Her voice was quiet, stripped of all artifice. "Thank you for this, James. For believing me." He just nodded, the gratitude feeling like a shared, unspoken prayer. Then she looked at him, her eyes filled with the terrible, fragile hope of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to have a champion. "What if we lose?" she whispered. He met her gaze, his own resolve as hard as steel. "We won't." But as the city lights twinkled obliviously outside, the question hung in the air, a phantom of the fight that was to come. His words, "We won't," hung in the air, a shield forged of sheer will. But in the days leading up to the hearing, fear was a constant, unwelcome guest in their small apartment. James saw it in the way Imani jumped every time the phone rang, and in the dark circles that shadowed her eyes. He brought groceries. He read books to Maya. He did everything he could to build a wall of normalcy around them, but they were both holding their breath, waiting. The courthouse was a cold, gray monolith, smelling of old paper and quiet desperation. James sat in the gallery, dressed in a simple suit that felt more like armor than clothing. He watched Imani at the table next to Robin, her back straight, her hands clenched in her lap. She wore the blue woolen coat, a silent, defiant statement of warmth in a place so cold. The shelter's lawyer was exactly as James had pictured, a man armed with binders and a voice that droned on about protocols, non-compliance, and the sanctity of the system's process. He painted Imani as reckless, her move to the apartment, an impulsive act that disregarded the careful structure designed to help people like her. It was a clinical, bloodless assassination of her character. Then, Robin stood up. She spoke with a calm, surgical precision, slicing through the jargon. Your Honor. She began what the opposition calls protocol. We call a labyrinth designed to keep people powerless. What they call non-compliance. We call a mother's desperate rational act to provide a safe home for her child. This isn't about a broken rule. This is about a broken system punishing a woman for having the audacity to escape it. The judge, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, listened intently before turning her gaze to Imani. Ms. Jones, I'd like to hear from you. Imani stood, her legs trembling. She took a deep breath, her eyes finding James in the crowd for a fleeting second. When she spoke, her voice was low, but clear, filled not with legal arguments, but with truth. Your Honor, I know the rules, but the rules don't tuck my daughter in at night. The rules don't keep her from hearing strangers scream in the hallways. The rules don't stop her from drawing storm clouds over every picture of a house she makes. Her voice cracked just once. I was offered a safe place, a door that locks, a home where my daughter could sleep without being afraid. I didn't break a rule, Your Honor. I did my job. I protected my child. A thick silence filled the courtroom. The judge looked down at the paperwork, then back at the shelter's representative, her expression hardening. Protocol is not law, she said, her voice sharp. And it is certainly not a shield for intimidation. The verdict was swift. The case was dismissed. A 5-year protective order was granted forbidding the shelter from contacting Imani or Maya in any capacity. As they stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the city sunlight felt like a benediction. Imani gasped a deep, shuddering breath of pure relief. I can breathe, she whispered, looking at the sky as if for the first time. James stood beside her. You earned that breath, Imani. They walked down the steps, not speaking the shared victory, a silent, powerful bond between them. As a taxi honked in the distance, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his chief of staff. Just a link with no comment. He opened it. The headline was from a sleazy online gossip rag. Billionaire's pet project, a glimpse inside James Holloway's newest charity case. Below it was a grainy, long-lens photo of him and Imani walking into the apartment building, her hand on his arm. They had won the battle in the courtroom, but he realized with a sickening lurch that the war had just begun, and it was about to be fought in front of the entire world. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, a cold dread creeping up his spine, eclipsing the warmth of their victory. He tried to shield Imani from it, to preserve the sanctity of their win for at least a few hours, but the poison spread too fast. By the next morning, it wasn't just one gossip blog. It was a torrent. More photos surfaced, blurry images of him pushing Maya on a swing of them, sharing a pizza on the floor of the new apartment. Anonymous sources from his own company began to whisper to reporters. The narrative they spun was a masterpiece of insinuation. He was the lonely, unstable billionaire using his wealth to control a vulnerable woman. She was the cunning opportunist, the gold digger who had masterfully played on his grief. The world that had once ignored her existence now relentlessly scrutinized it, twisting her resilience into ambition and her dignity into a scheme. The apartment, their safe harbor, became a gilded cage. Imani stopped taking Maya to the park. She unplugged the phone. The joy and relief were replaced by a familiar, hunted look in her eyes. The storm cloud had returned bigger and darker than ever. Then came the summons he knew was inevitable. The board of directors of Holloway Capital requested his presence. The conference room was a theater of silent judgment. 12 faces, including that of his own younger brother Daniel, looked at him with expressions ranging from concern to cold calculation. Evelyn Marks, the chairwoman, spoke first, her voice smooth as polished granite. James, the board has concerns about public perception. The stock has seen a slight dip. Our brand is built on stability, and this is a distraction. His brother Daniel leaned forward, his face a mask of earnest worry. Jim, we're worried about you. This woman and her child. Are you sure you know what you're doing? Think of our family's name. Think of what Dad built. The condescension wrapped in the guise of love was the cruelest cut of all. James looked at their faces, these people who measured life in quarterly reports and stock prices, and he felt nothing but a vast, empty pity for them. He stood up not in anger, but with a strange, liberating calm. "You want to talk about what Dad built?" He began, his voice quiet, but filling the room. "He built a company. I have spent the last 3 years living inside a tomb of his success. For 3 years, I was a ghost. I signed deals, I made money, and I felt nothing." He held up his wrist, showing them the child's frayed bracelet. "Then, I met a little girl who gave me this, because I looked sad. And I met her mother, a woman who, in the face of a collapsing world, had the courage to fight for my wife when no one else would. They didn't see a brand or a stock price. They saw a human being." He looked directly at Evelyn. "You are concerned about our image. I am concerned with my soul. They reminded me I had one." There was a stunned silence. Evelyn finally broke it, her voice losing its smoothness. "This is unacceptable. The board requires you to take a step back from this situation. Issue a statement. Clarify that this was a philanthropic gesture that has been misconstrued. Reassure our investors." The ultimatum was clear. Choose the empire or choose them. James looked from his brother's pleading face to Evelyn's unyielding stare. He thought of Imani's quiet strength and Maya's brilliant laugh. He thought of the blue woolen coat. The choice wasn't a choice at all. "Thank you for your concern, Evelyn," he said, his voice serene. "But you're asking me to amputate my own heart to save the brand. You're asking me to choose between this table and my humanity." He paused, letting the weight of his final words settle in the sterile air. "And it's the easiest choice I have ever made." He turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind his name, his fortune, and his entire world, feeling not a sense of loss, but of being for the very first time completely and utterly free. He walked out of that building and didn't look back. The city air, once the sterile atmosphere of his ambition, now tasted of freedom. He went straight to the apartment, the only real home he had. When he told Imani what he had done, he saw the reaction he dreaded. Terror and guilt flooded her eyes. "You lost everything," she whispered, her voice filled with self-recrimination. "It's my fault." He reached across the table and took her hands, his grip firm and steady. "Imani, look at me. I didn't lose anything. I escaped. For years, I was the richest man in a graveyard of my own making. You and Maya, you didn't lead me to ruin. You led me back to life. I didn't do this for you. I did it for me." In that moment, she finally understood. This wasn't a sacrifice. It was a resurrection. The media firestorm eventually faded, as all such storms do, chasing the next scandal. In the quiet that followed, a new life began to take root. It was a life measured not in stock tickers, but in small, sacred moments. James patiently helping Maya with her math homework, the smell of Imani's late-night coffee as she studied for her nursing exams, the easy laughter they shared while washing dishes together. It was a smaller life, but it was an infinitely larger world. The day Imani passed her final exam, she didn't shout with joy. She stood by the window, holding the official email, and a quiet, radiant smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a mountain climber reaching the summit after a long and treacherous ascent. James watched her, his heart full. He hadn't given her this victory. He had simply given her the solid ground she needed to win it for herself. A few months later, on a rainy afternoon, he sat with her at their small kitchen table, a stack of legal documents between them. "I'm starting a foundation," he said. "I'm using the personal capital I have left. I want to help people who fall through the cracks of the system, people who just need a stable place to stand so they can start climbing." He pushed a document toward her. "I'm calling it the Bridge Project. And it won't work without you. Your experience, your heart. It's more valuable than any check I could write. I don't want you to work for it, Imani. I want you to build it with me, as my partner." 1 year later, they sat in a modest office, the logo for the bridge project on the door. Across from them sat a young woman, her face etched with the same fear and exhaustion Imani once wore. She was a single mother, fleeing an impossible situation, distrustful of help. James remained silent. It was Imani who leaned forward, her voice a soft melody of empathy and strength. "I know you're scared," she began. "I know it feels like no one is listening. I was you." As she spoke, sharing her story, the young woman's shoulders began to relax. A flicker of hope ignited in her eyes. Sitting at a small table in the corner, Maya, now 7, had been coloring. She looked up, sensing the shift in the room. She quietly walked over to the young mother, her expression serious. She held out her small hand. In it was a brand new bracelet, woven from threads of brilliant blue and sunny yellow. "Here," Maya said, her voice clear and true. "You should wear this. It helps." James watched as the woman took the bracelet, her trembling fingers closing around the simple, profound gift. The circle was complete. The hug offered in the dead of winter had become a bridge, and on it, 100 new journeys were just beginning.